Craig from Arms and Armor, and today we're going to look at a little bit of a different subject in our blog post. We're going to talk about how medieval sword blades were finished. Some of this will be able to look at some originals and get some clues, and then we'll also turn to some historical information discussing and showing how these things came about. It's an interesting subject and one that often comes up in conversations with people, and they have some difficulty understanding exactly how swords were made back in the period, as it was much more a process of almost like woodworking than what we would think of today as far as forging and grinding in our ways of using electrical power, motor, wheels, all those kind of things, grinding belts. And we'll look at some of the variations on that that were part of the medieval experience of producing a sword. The first piece we'll look at is this sword from the 11th century. Here, when we're looking at detail of the blade, you can see a few things that will help us understand what we see later on in some of the other swords, because it's very difficult to say this is an original finish or this is a grind finish that you would have found on this particular sword, as it's so old and has been through so long a lifetime of use or display that we have a lot of things that may have happened to it over time. What we can see is here we have an inscription in there, a little sun symbol, and that is definitely a piece that is going to show us where that original surface probably laid, because this would not be very deeply done. So we know that in parts of this blade we are seeing some surface that is close to the original shape. What we also see is this very rough structure where it is corroded and you have deep pits, and they almost look kind of wood-natured in a sense that you have a kind of a grain to them. And this is a factor of a wrought steel or wrought iron blade, showing how it was stretched and manipulated by the hammer and heat. Over time then, you have this happening and the corrosion pieces flake out, inclusions or shunts, as it were, from the forging allow things to flake off in a sense to give you that kind of an appearance. And there's also something that we'll see later on in some of the swords where the finish is really created because of the material it's made from. As we move down this blade slightly, we see that it has more of a finish here that is probably close to the original surface of the sword. It is not particularly deeply ridged or anything, but you can see striations still down in there. Now, whether those happened at the original time of the sword being made or not is difficult to say, but it is also something that definitely could be there from when it was originally surfaced. Here we have a medieval blade that is unmounted. It was probably sent as an export of an antique blade that was used for colonial use or something like that, and remounted on a hilt in an area that would be appropriate for the period of wherever it was ending up. Now, but this particular blade shows, again, some of these wrought elements where you can kind of see things appearing, coming up through the material that is part of the material itself. But we can also see very deep marks running along the recessed section of the fuller here. And this is where you usually want to look for this kind of evidence in a blade, is in recessed areas or areas that are a little protected, because those would most likely continue to have some of that original finish from the blade as it was in period when it was finished anew. This particular one here shows these pieces with some of these lines that would have been the heavy grits used, but then again would be polished higher or on the upper surfaces, leaving these deeper grooves still showing but kind of polished. And this is a finish that you see in armor and weapons a lot from the period. It's something that in most cases people today would not accept in a finished piece, but is something that is very appropriate to those kind of things being done in period. On this particular piece, North Italian, probably 1480 or so, we see again in the fullers some indication that while it was finished and the original surface is still somewhat there, you have deeper lines running through it. So you would have had a more polished element, and then also these deep lines still in the polishing being seen from the particular tools that they were using in this period. Now those tools to create these kinds of fullers and shapes of the blade, as we will discuss in the text of this post, sometimes were scrapers, sometimes were wheels, and sometimes were used as tools that had a cutting head mounted in them. You can also see some deep marks on the guard here that may very well have been the finishing marks from the original surface as well. But then you can also see the highlighted areas, the kind of shiny bits, are the parts where you have the wear and tear being worked on the weapon over its lifetime. Here we have an 18th century hanger, English, and it shows a different style of finishing in that it's highly polished in its fullers, but you can still see striations running along here in the finish itself. Even though it's polished, you can see the deeper lines. But on its cutting edge, it's been cross-ground, and you can see it's quite heavily done with a pretty aggressive grit, but it is already etched and marked over that. So this was the finish that was done at the period of the time for the finished piece. This is a style weapon that many people would have had for travel or personal protection, and is a relatively high status piece. But you can see that these heavier grind marks would have not have been a detriment to this piece being accepted in period. And finally, we'll look in detail at this blade of a 1796 saber. It is an officer's model, so it is kind of a high status piece. It has been blued and gilt, as you can see in the picture here. And this particular piece shows those heavy grind lines running along the blade here that go right underneath the bluing where it is still fresh and not rubbed. Here along the ridge, you can see that it has been rubbed from going in and out of the scabbard and some use. And so this obviously indicates that these lines that you see coming back and forth here that go through the bluing are probably from wear. But the lines you see down in the blade here going all the way through, right through the bluing, indicate that the surface of this piece, though highly polished, would have still shown those grind marks from the period. So I hope looking at these pieces and understanding a little bit of how the finishes that you might have seen in period helps inform your ideas of what the medieval sword was like. It's an interesting topic, and there's lots of different examples out there in many varying states of preservation, but also in status as far as how much was paid for them at the time. You have to realize that in any given human production, there's always a variable of quality and what they were trying to achieve. So somebody producing swords for an armory where they were being bought by the barrelful would probably spend a little less time doing the finishing than someone who was going to a cutler in a high status area of town and purchasing a piece that was for show as well as defense. So you want to balance those things when you're looking at medieval pieces and how they would have evolved over time and what the sword finishing of the period was like, because sometimes our modern ideas of what a sword should be do not match up with what a sword was. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll talk to you soon.